Okay, hello everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us for this event. My name is Alissa Bazinet. I'm a queer identified femme. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director of the Social Neuroscience and Psychotherapy Lab, also known as the SNAP Lab. The mission of the SNAP Lab is to maximize the benefits of therapeutic alliance and psychotherapy through the adjunct use of social psychopharmacology, including psychedelics such as psilocybin and MDMA. We're currently conducting clinical trials of psilocybin-assisted therapy for meth use disorder, as well as MDMA-assisted group psychotherapy for PTSD, including a study for transgender and gender-diverse identified individuals with PTSD. In line with our values of diversity and equitable access within psychedelic science, SNAP is offering educational forums for the public to highlight diverse voices across the psychedelic space. So today we're continuing SNAP's three-part Conscious Community series celebrating Pride Month. I'd like to offer the call to action that the celebration of diversity and offerings of access and equity within the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA community not be confined to the month of June. The luminaries we will be hearing from in this series lead by that example and are celebrated individuals working in the fields of mental health, academia, and other medicine spaces. Throughout this series, we'll be highlighting Two-Spirit LGBTQIA thought leaders in the psychedelic space, discussing pertinent experiences in the field of psychedelics, to include topics of ethics, justice, diversity, access, and equity. Today, our panelists will share with us their perspectives on ethics from a queer perspective. I'm joined by my co-moderator, Diana Quinn, a queer naturopathic doctor and healing justice practitioner who is a new member of SNAP, and she also serves as the Associate Director of Community Care in the Center for Psychedelic Studies at Naropa University.
Thank you, Alissa, and welcome everyone. Happy to be here with you this evening. Before introducing our guest speakers for the evening, Alissa and I want to begin by offering a grounding and some acknowledgements, land acknowledgements, to bring us into collective awareness here in the space. So I'll invite you to take a moment to settle in, and if you'd like, you can cast your gaze downward or close your eyes and just be present for a moment with your breath. Just allowing everything that you were doing a moment ago fall away, and allow yourself to come fully into this space, being with the breath and paying attention to your seat and your feet on the ground, the points of contact your body is making with the earth and the supports that are holding you in this moment. Allowing yourself to give more of your weight to gravity as you settle in and find your center for another cycle of breath here for just a moment. Just being present with what is, connecting down to the Great Mother, the earth below, and acknowledging the lands on which we are all residing and calling in from in this moment. As you come back into the space, bring your awareness into the room. I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Anishinaabe territory in Wew'uwat'en, also known as Detroit, Michigan, and acknowledge that the SNAP Lab is based in Portland, Oregon, on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Chinook, Cayuse, Umatilla, Cowlitz, Multnomah, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and Confederated Tribes of the Silets Indians and their people. Acknowledging solidarity and allyship with the original peoples of these lands, past, present, and future, in solidarity for movements for land back and for protection of the land, the water, and for the more than human beings that we share this beautiful planet with. So as we complete our land acknowledgement, I'll invite all of you, if you'd like, to comment in the chat about where you're calling in from, where you're located, and if you know the original peoples and Indigenous stewards of the lands you're on. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. So this will be a 90-minute presentation in total today, with time at the end for Q&A with our panelists. We ask everyone to please remain muted throughout the presentation. You can be on or off screen, whatever feels most comfortable to you. We will close the chat during the presentation from the speakers in order to devote our attention fully to the speakers, but please do keep track of any questions that you have for our speakers and enter them into the chat during the Q&A segment. We'll keep track of the questions and curate the discussion. We may invite you to unmute and ask your question directly at that time. If you need any other support throughout the presentation, please send a chat message to Diana or I, or one of the hosts. And we ask you to join us in holding this space with respect, integrity, and care.
So today's presentation is on the ethics of psychedelic therapy from a queer lens. And our speakers this evening are Emma Knighton, who holds an MA in counseling psychology from Bastyr University, a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies and research from CIAS, and a master's level certificate in holistic health from St. Catherine University. They also are a registered yoga teacher, encompassing the integration of therapy, yoga, and psychedelic practices. We have Mae Northrup, the author of the book Radical Healership and the creator of the Inside Eyes podcast, an audio series about people using entheogens and psychedelics to heal from sexual trauma. Drawing from her work as a practicing somatic and psychedelic psychotherapist, she focuses on defining sexual violence through a spiritual and politicized lens while mentoring healing practitioners in creating a meaningful path and supporting the spiritual integrity of our collective humanity. And we have Florie St. Aimé, who describes herself as a liberation-based clinician, rooting her work in naming and blaming social constructs instead of individuals, and encouraging curiosity and feeling as resistance, and practicing human connection and care towards all beings as radical action. Florie invites others into liberation practices through organizing and activism, group facilitation and workshops, individual counseling, holding sacred space, and clinical supervision. Welcome to each of our panelists.
And now we'd like to give each of our panelists a few minutes to share any more they'd like to share about themselves and their work, specifically as it pertains to psychedelic ethics. So Florie, if you would go first.
Yep, can do that. Hi, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's really exciting to just scroll through names and see faces of people. So yeah, feeling all of that in. What is the question I'm supposed to be answering? Sorry, I got distracted. I was looking at people's faces while I was talking.
No problem. Anything you'd like to share about your work as it pertains to psychedelic ethics?
Yeah, I think I've had, psychedelic ethics is new to me, but I've had a ongoing fight with the mental health industry forever, and as a clinician myself, and what we're calling ethics, what we think is ethical, what is the right way to be a normal person, who describes that, and how as clinicians we don't really ask much questions of that, and it's really disturbing that psychedelics is getting its cues from the mental health field, and so that is translated in, as I've gone into psychedelic world, that I'm like really trying to like shout out most times, like, hey, these are not the models, these are not the, why are we relying on the mental health industry to tell us what the right things to do here are, and feeling like my job is to just go around places planting a seed of doubt wherever I can, like, is this the right person that we should be asking? Are these the right systems we should be relying on? Are these the right questions we should be asking? And so that to me is kind of how I've fallen into talking about ethics a lot as of late, and being in ethics conversations around psychedelics, because I've just had a long ongoing fight with what does ethics mean in the mental health field. And it just feels just scarier here in this new world, actually. So That's and I do that in a bunch of random places that wouldn't even make sense to name all right now. And so I'm really excited to just engage in conversations about it and to keep challenging us and shaking our the places that we find security, shaking it up a bit. Yeah.
Thank you. Emma, anything more you'd like to share about your work as it pertains to psychedelic ethics?
Sure. Thanks, Florie, for starting us off. A lot of the work that I do in the field is around consent. And so I do a lot of teaching and talking and inquiry and play around what consent looks like in our field. And I think for me, I've just like started having this as part of the kind of public persona of how I show up in the space, of naming that I am the child of 2 survivors of cult abuse, and that really comes into my work. And just seeing all the spaces in this field where people are out of alignment, where there is shadow coming out, where there is abuse in the field, and really encouraging the community to come together around accountability and around what consent looks like, and challenging these norms of secrecy, and also not trying to move away from replicating the punitive justice system. And to me, like, the queerness in that is trying to move away from the binary and instead co-creating something with each other, right? And saying there isn't actually one model for how to do this, but like, how is this arising in the moment? And, looking to my lived experience education in the kink community and in non-monogamy communities of like, let's make this. We get to make this however we want this to look. And that it is a co-creation of all the different like bodies and ancestry and trauma histories and all of those things in the room together, and that's actually what creates the magic of the space. And so thinking like, when I think or talk or teach about ethics, it's not like, what's the ethical code we're abiding by? Like, let's throw that out the window and instead ask like, what's alive in our community, in the room, in the relationship, and then develop a structure that leads us towards, safe enough in a way that actually supports what we're doing. And yeah, that feels like a good place to stop for now.
Thanks, Emma. Laura?
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. It's very rare that I get to do anything that's queer related, so I'm really excited about that. And that's a problem, that there's not enough of that in our world, like in the psychedelic world. So probably one of the primary ways that I intersect with talking about ethics is that I get asked a lot about sexual ethics violations. A lot of my work is focused on survivors of sexual trauma. And then in my past, I spent about 3 years working with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, which for people who aren't familiar with transformative justice, it's kind of similar to restorative justice with a couple of differences. And prior to that, I just spent a lot of time working in community, like how do we respond when somebody does something harmful? And how do we sort of like prevent that too? And these are really hard questions to answer. So, and what is harm? Like what is unethical and what's not unethical? And so it's been a big part of the activism that I've done in the past, a big part of my life leading up to becoming a practitioner, and then continues on. And so I have a special interest in working with clinicians around their like ethical and non-ethical practices. And I consult a lot on cases where people are sort of wondering what's ethical to do. And there's so much being right there in what's not a binary. Like so much of when we think about ethics, we think of good, bad. We think of accountability. We think of good, bad. And there's so much more nuance. And that type of dichotomy, much like the gender binary, is really misleading and does not necessarily lead us towards more well-being. So excited to be here and get into this conversation with you all.
Well, thank you, each of you. And we'll move now into some questions and invite each of you to speak to a few different questions that we have for you. And you all kind of spoke to this in a sense in terms of, kind of alluding to disrupting binaries, but I'm wondering if you can share more about your thoughts on queering systems and structures of accountability.
Thanks. Yeah, I have so many. And so I think the what I ultimately always go towards is that queering for me, I've said this, queering for me doesn't mean making it accessible to us. Queering for me means like doing something outside of it. Queering means is deeply abolitionist. So they're like deeply connected to me, that like it is more than like trying to get more of us in a room. But it's actually a lot about saying this room doesn't work. And so those systems, we have to think about like, what about that is something that we want anyway? Like, why do we want to be in there? And I think what I found most of the time is when I think about the systems I try to get myself in, is like, there's a false sense that there's a safety in there. And yet we see over and over again, those same systems are what make us unsafe. And so queering and being in the system feel like they're just really always like, many things are, they're always going to be in conflict. And it's okay to choose to be in conflict. Like if you can handle that, if you really feel like, listen, I'm here to like stay in the rumble tumble. I'm here to like be with the rough and difficult. I'm here to like do the push. I'm here to, if that is your work, then sure, like you can talk about you being a queer thing, person, entity in the system, but the system will never be queer. Like it can't be. Like that's essentially what is opposing at all times, like actually trying to make things fall into categories. And so it'll always be in against. And I think it's a beautiful thing for people to keep trying because they hold that rigor. Like you got that energy, do it. But also really look to the people who are like leaving it and just being like, there's something outside of here, like for what you're missing when you're working, struggling in there, while I'm struggling in there, while we're struggling in there.
I want to just jump in here and say, Florie, I really appreciate what you're saying. And, kind of what I hear in that is this question that I think as anybody who's in any kind of activist realm, there's always this question of reform or just make a new system. And I struggle a lot with like, I mean, I'm like burn it all down and capitalism. But, then there are people who really need some level of reform because it like soothes an immediate need. And so I just appreciate being in the complexity of it because 100% burn it all down, make a new system. And I like what you're saying about like even the question of like queering a system in a sense implies that we're going to stay in that same system and queer it as opposed to create something completely outside of it. Yeah, appreciating that. And then I guess I'll also just add in, when I think about queerness, like in the medicine work I've done, there's nothing really inherently that queer about being queer. What makes it queer is the system that we live in that says that it's not okay. So then you're divergent from something that's being stated as normal. But I don't think that the act of being queer in its very pure form is actually that divergent from normalcy or from what's a normal part of the human experience. And so in that way, I think about like queerness in the world that we're living in is about, to me, a lot about embracing truth. It's a lot about saying like, this is what's true for me, or this is what's true for this person, or this is what's true for our community, and going toward it, even if it's really uncomfortable. And in terms of like systems of accountability, I think that's actually a really similar thing that we're doing with accountability. We're kind of saying, can we be in the truth of it? And the truth is not one truth, like people have really different versions of what truth is. People have really different versions of how they experience things. Can we embrace kind of the multiple ways that somebody has, for example, in this case, we're talking about psychedelic ethics within some type of healing work, multiple ways that someone may have experienced the same moment or the same action. And can we find our way to that truth? And sometimes that means acknowledging things that are, again, just truth, uncomfortable, like that you yourself have done something harmful, or that that anyone can commit some form of harm. So that's sort of like a way that I am connecting queerness and systems of accountability, and sort of a queer way of interacting with accountability is just being very invested in what's really here.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Thanks, Florie. Just brilliant. I love listening to you talk. I think that I appreciate the naming of truth. And I think for me, a lot of what queerness means to me, just like personally and also in general, is about like letting go of the need to arrive anywhere and instead existing in the fluidity of that. Like for me in my own like gender identity exploration process, I remember the moment where I was like, oh, I don't have to like pick a label and then stay there. Like I haven't like checked the queer box when I'm like, got it. And now this is my title and we're going to stay there forever, you know, and that actually it's like the process of just being in the dance and who am I today and where are the parts emerging and how is this like constant expansion process and allowing that. And I think in terms of accountability, I think letting go of this idea that we're ever going to arrive at a specific place of now everyone's accountable, or as a system, or ever arrive at a place where we are like, I am now in 100% accountable, completely lined up, ethical person that I can never fuck up ever again. Like, I don't actually believe that any of us will get there. And I think that creating a new system for and by ourselves, that ourselves meaning like, if we're talking about queer people, like those in the queer community, that actually leaves room for our humanity and for the constant evolution of who we are and learning more about ourselves. Because I know for me, like if someone came to me, a practitioner came to me and told me I've done all my shadow work and I'm done now, I'd be like, you are going to hurt somebody. Like that is immediately a sign for me, right? And so how can we have a community system of accountability where there's actually room for people to be like, I'm having this impulse and this feels difficult for me, and holding each other in that rather than creating some kind of system that says we're expecting you to be perfect, and instead actually honoring and celebrating the fluidity of us learning more about ourselves as we're interacting with other people that we're working with.
Is there room to, oh, you go, Florie.
Yeah, what I was going to say is this also just reminding, just like the accountability structures just need to be so responsive to the relationships already in the system that like you can't possibly know the thing that you're holding someone accountable to without really understanding their moral stance, right? Like accountability systems that are standards that go across the board will always fall short because they aren't responsive to the relationships and the people that you're trying to hold accountable in it. And so what you just brought up really reminded me that like accountability requires that there's real deep knowing of the people that we hope to one day be able to be held accountable by, and that we hope to like be supporting in upholding their own values, the things that matter to them, like the morals they would like to uphold. And that requires a lot of pre-work that general systems aren't built to do. And so like it does require like these really intricate, intimate systems that that get lost when using the word system at all. Like it immediately blows up in my head to something huge, but actually like something super tiny is what I think I'm hearing like feels where it could happen.
So we actually have to have relationships with each other, is what you're saying?
Unfortunately, yeah, it seems so.
Mm-hmm.
I love this part of the conversation because when I unmuted, I was also like, we got to talk about intimacy. And yeah, it's something I like to point out sometimes is, you know, like I really feel that Christian supremacy and white supremacy are very much against intimacy. And, you know, like what you were just saying, Florie, like I think about the kind of systems that you're talking about that are there's sort of like, this is what accountability is, and we're going to do it to you. It's really very carceral thinking. It's like, and it's very hard being socialized in a world that thinks so carcerally to move away from punishment and into accountability, also because we just don't even really have that effective of models. And I think part of why we don't have effective models is very much related to capitalism, because there's a way that, very few people at this point, at least in the United States where most of us are residing, are living in communities where the community doesn't change. Like the community is long-term, the same people over a lifetime, which is a really particular kind of intimacy. And so much accountability takes a really long time. Like this is something that's just a huge issue. And I'm sure many people can relate to this, where, you're like, okay, we're going to do an accountability process. And it's like, you might have to spend a year with somebody just talking to them about, I don't know, like their substance use, or, they're like we were just saying, Florie, like, what are your beliefs? Okay, can you understand how this thing, caused harm? Okay, not yet. We're still doing this. And it just requires an incredible level of commitment to the people involved. And a lot of time. And there's actually a really interesting documentary called Hollow Water about people doing like an accountability process it's more of a restorative justice process. But in the documentary, and it's about childhood sexual abuse, when I watch that and I wonder, why were they able to do it? So much of it relates to the fact that it's a tribe that is really they're staying together for generations in a way where they're not like, oh, you're just some random person who was here that I did at a ketamine clinic. We had a coworker situationship, and now, like you did something bad, and I don't know, I saw you on Facebook. It's like deep long-term connection. So I don't know if that's a queer lens. I'm queer and I'm saying it, but this is just, I think, a really big part of it is like pushing back against this major fragmentation in our communities and just being in more intimate relationship.
I know we have other questions, but I just want to add one piece of that. I think we also need to update our definition of intimacy to include conflict and actually like allowing and celebrating conflict as part of the intimacy process. Of that, I know for me that somebody coming to me and saying, Emma, you hurt me and here's how I feel about it, I feel loved and cared for when someone does that to me, because it means you give a shit enough about our relationship to actually want to process the hard thing. And that I think so much of our structure, and I think a lot of this comes from capitalism and colonization and Puritan culture, is the like, we're all fine, everything's fine, right? The kind of like white Anglo-Saxon mentality around that. And that true intimacy actually comes when we can go through that rupture and repair process. And that our accountability systems and the punitive justice system we have now, and the very like individualized you over here, does not actually allow for us to be in connection around that. And that the ability to sit across from someone and see that and feel that with them and regulate your nervous system through it, I think is a way that moves us towards accountability that actually supports healing instead of just deeper separation.
I'm sorry, Alyssa, can I add one more?
Absolutely, please.
And
I'm loving this discussion.
Okay, great. And then what I'm hearing so loudly is like, it's so heartbreaking how disposable we all are. Like that, if you are in conflict in a world that says like, you should feel fine, I could just stop being in relationship with you. Like that is enough reason. And being in a culture that from childhood has told us that we are actually quite disposable. Like we could just not be in relationship. And queerness has shown us and all types of people who have borrowed and learned from queerness, creating chosen family, where they're like, you are not disposable to me. People borrowing that from queer folks. But truly, like, I think there's just so much that we're not like grieving about. Like, we live in a culture that says I can be thrown out. And so to feel that love of someone's coming up to you saying like, you've hurt me, requires them to know that you're not going to throw me out when I say it. And like the fact that that doesn't feel like a given is what keeps people from doing the thing, saying the thing, and even admitting the thing. You know, if they were hurt, being able to say like, well, actually, yeah, I mean, if they hurt you, to be able to say like, I see how I hurt you. I can't even say that because by admitting it, I have there's an opportunity to be thrown out, And so I think there's just like a lot of deep sadness in me listening to that about like how much we don't get to know that we're still going to be kept. And that keeps us from living into our own personal moral and values.
Yeah, I want to just piggyback off this, and then I promise I won't speak again until you ask another question. But this is a really touchy subject, but how do we also, maintain being able to see the humanity of people who've caused harm? And we have to be willing to maintain our own humanity and understand that we can cause harm. And this can get so tricky in circles where people talk about harm and accountability of kind of, I guess what I want to say is like, how do we have a really firm stance about someone having caused harm and still really respect them as a person? Because I actually think that furthers their capacity to be accountable. And how do we honor and respect them as a person and hold their humanity, even if in this lifetime they can never find a way to be accountable? And how do we then sort of, especially in the psychedelic space, how are we responding to that? Because that is possible, that some people's healing arc is really, really, really long. And so I really appreciate what you're saying, Florie, because I agree. So much of this is about people, feeling respected, having their dignity, not being thrown away, but also back to that piece about truth, like how do we still hold the deep, deep complexity of what harm is and what that means in a community?
Well, I'm loving this discussion so far. And actually, what you all are speaking to is a beautiful segue into the next question. I'm loving this conversation about intimacy being redefined as including conflict and that being a really crucial part of intimacy. And so the next question that we had for you all is, what are your thoughts on ethics within medical models in the psychedelic industry, given the historical and ongoing legacies of harm within the medical industrial complex? So speaking of conflict and how we do things differently.
Florie, I feel like you got to talk first.
I'm just like, I was trying not to. When you saw me was
feel
literally
you
starting to
wanting
write
to.
notes to myself. I'm like writing notes like,
I know Florie's got something to start us off with here. So
you
don't have to.
Yeah, no, I was trying to rein it in. Yes, I have so many feelings and thoughts. Well, I'm gonna flat out say I don't think it's possible. Like, I don't think we can do psychedelics in the medical model. Well, of course we will, because we're here. It will happen. I don't think we can. And the reason I don't think we can is because the medical model, like I mentioned earlier, is built on creating what is normal. Like Laura was saying, like we're only queer in retrospect, in relative to someone else's idea of what normal is. And the medical model is built to name what normal is and then enforce what normal is. And that's its whole job. Its job is to name normal and then enforce normal. And it's doing that all the time. And psychedelics are constantly fucking people up because they're like, whoa, 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 I thought I was in this normal camp, but it seems I'm not. It's literally constantly showing us how unnormal we are. And so they are always going to be conflicting. And I think that's when we have to remember that like the medical model has a moral agenda. It comes from a place of Puritan, but way before Puritan, a very neocortical supremacy that like strategy is better than feeling, future is better than present, data and being able to mold the future is better than being with whatever it is, right? That's the moral compass of the medical model. And all of that is anti-psychedelics. Like it just feels like that is actually impossible. So I think when we do the medical model thing, which is going to happen, again, we just have to be really good with the conflict of being in it, that we're actually working on two completely separate sides of something, and like get really comfortable with the ways that we have to contradict ourselves in it. Like we can't lie about what we're doing in here. I can't lie about what I'm doing in here. I have to be really comfortable with the contradictions that I'm living in, and I have to be able to name them for people, because then they get to decide how they want to be with me, and other people get to name their contradictions to me, and I get to fully decide how I want to be with them, like inside of this medical industrial complex that we're in, because it's made to do the opposite of what we're hoping, what most of us are hoping we can really experience in this lifetime with psychedelics. And so those are my first round of thoughts, but I feel like at this rate, we're going to have a few more.
I want to hear all the rest of your thoughts, Florie. I also want to just chime in here and say, like, I'm sure a lot of people listening know this, that one of the major criteria that's used in the DSM for, delineating if somebody or assessing if somebody meets certain mental health criteria is if they can go to work, like if their work is affected. And, I'm just like, I think we saw actually with the pandemic, like a lot of people just being like, my job is bad for me. My job makes me depressed. Should we be working this way? Should we be working where, there's so many things I could say about that. And so that right there, one of my biggest critiques of this model of mental health that we, kind of have to operate within is that it's so much about upholding capitalism and upholding a certain way of experiencing capitalism. Like those criteria don't say like, the client or person has a reasonable reaction to being oppressed by their boss. That criteria, it's like, why doesn't this person want to be functional in society in a really particular way? So I'll pause. I have more to say, but I'll pause.
Yeah, I think the thing that's coming up for me, particularly for when you're talking about like the normal and what is upholding the normal, of that it's telling us what's normal, it's upholding the normal, and it's also giving us very clear definitions of what not normal looks like. And that's the thing that we are judging ourselves based on, is the list of criteria of here's what you look like when you're wrong. And here's what you look like when you're not in line with exactly how you're supposed to be functioning in this incredibly oppressive and problematic society. And for me, the entering of ethics into the medical system, and it being tied to, you have to have one of these diagnoses, that's there's so many problems over, but that's the thing like really comes out for me strongly, of saying that you have to match this list of things in order to get access to these medicines, to these therapies. And to me, that's actually like reinforcing people being ill and saying this thing could really help, and also could just like expand your consciousness in all these ways, but you better be wrong. You better be not normal in order for you to have access to this. And that just creates this system of keeping people ill, right? And I think that's what our medical system does, is we don't have a health system, we have a sick system. We don't pay our doctors when we're healthy, we pay them when we're sick. And so it is profitable for us to be ill. And I think that the psychedelic industry, by attaching access to these therapies with diagnoses, and the more extreme diagnoses, is just participating in that of keeping people ill, when what we're saying is we're trying to help people. And I just think that those things are not actually, they don't make sense when you think about them logically.
Round two. And so I wanted to add also though, like what you just said is like, yeah, and if you have certain diagnoses, you're excluded. You have no access if you're too wrong, if you're too ill, if you're too sick, if you're too far from normal, you can't. And so it really is a setup on both ends, which is like, you can't be normal, you can't be too sick, you have to be just right for us to see you as a viable person to help, like that you are even interesting to us to offer. And that is that's how the system is rolling out. And there doesn't seem to be any movement towards something different, because we know the medical model historically has never looked to do anything different than that. We've historically just put the people who are too sick away. And so that doesn't seem like there'll be any opportunity that be different in the psychedelic medical model.
Yeah, and I'll throw out there, I know there are people, I want to acknowledge there are people, of course, again, reform. There are people who are trying to bring about studies and sort of include people who have diagnoses that are currently excluded, but it's an uphill battle, and it really also sort of brings into question, and this is maybe like, another piece of this sort of medical model of like, who knows what's best? Do people who need the support, need the help, want to try psychedelics who are currently excluded? Are their voices important in the way that research studies are designed? Are their voices important in how care is designed? Or is this something where people who do not experience those diagnoses will be the only people deciding whether or not those people have access, or how a study would go for them? And, I'll just go back to capitalism again, because I love talking about how much I don't like it. It's interesting, like this piece about, somebody having, let's say, some type of psychosis after experiencing a psychedelic. I haven't talked to so many people about this, but I've talked to enough people that have said one of the biggest reasons why they can't take that risk is because of what happens if they go into psychosis, not necessarily because they aren't willing to go into psychosis potentially, but because of the fact that they won't be able to work and that we don't have systems to care for them. Even though there might be some curiosity, like, could I try this and could it really help me? And I have an episode on my podcast where I interview somebody who went into a type of like soft psychosis that I encourage people to check out if you're interested. And she had a lot of really interesting things to say about how powerful the psychosis was. But and I say this to say, I think there's an idea that psychosis is bad, as opposed to it's a thing that happens. And maybe some people don't want to experience it. And also maybe some people partly don't want to experience it because of what's happening around them in reaction to them experiencing it. So just like another little piece there. And then I think another thing I'd say about just like ethics within the medical system and like sort of queering ethics in the medical system, I don't really know quite how to say this. I feel like it's maybe a cultural value. And maybe it's actually really quite simple, just that I really think people need to be exploring and breaking down their concepts of gender very deeply if they want to do this work. And partly I think that's because psychedelics do take us into a place where things are so expansive. And for you to be able to go to that place with the people that you work with means being able to go to that place. And that means being able to go to that place with gender. And I've just, I hear so many really offensive ideas about queer and trans people regularly. A huge one that relates to the work I do is the idea that people become queer and trans because of childhood sexual abuse. And I know that for some people that might seem kind of like an out there idea, but it's actually pretty common. And I think that there's people who think it and say it, and then there's people who think it and just know not to say it, but that people still really think it. And something that's maybe challenges that idea. Well, I'll say, if being sexually abused as a child made people queer and trans, there would be a lot more queer and trans people. I'll just say that because there's a lot of childhood sexual abuse. But also children who are gender nonconforming are more likely to be targeted for sexual abuse. So the correlation between people who are queer and trans who have also been sexually abused it might be the reverse, that they're actually being attacked partly in reaction because of people's really harmful perceptions of gender. And that's just something I think is really important for us to acknowledge in the field. And obviously, I think a lot of people probably know about the model where, you get MDMA and you have a man and a woman and they're your guides, and that's because they're mommy and daddy and et cetera, et cetera. And in that, I also embrace multiple truths. That might be really meaningful for some people, and it's not for other people. In fact, it could be triggering. It could be really misattuned, and it's, you know what I'm saying.
I think the one thing I want to add too about the medical industrial complex is that, and psychedelics entering in that way, is that it upholds the hierarchy around licensed or unlicensed practitioners. And that that hierarchy is like in and of itself a representation of the oppressive systems of who has access to white English speaking people, who has enough money to pay for that education, who has enough money to get licensed. And like all of the pieces are there. When someone has a license, there is a full system behind them of the reason that has even been accessible, or that you even chose it. Like there are so many different reasons to be licensed or to not to be licensed. And that the way that we're going, you know, we haven't gotten the rules yet, so we don't know what it's going to look like of who can practice, but it's pretty certain that at least one of the people are in that room are going to have some kind of practitioner license. And what kind of hierarchy is that telling us then, right? And when we look at that in relationship to the colonization of psychedelics, of people who have land-based rituals and people who've been practicing for decades outside of having a license, typically actually have more experience with this and know what they're doing in a very different way than people who have licenses. And so if we're going to, especially as we're looking at insurance reimbursement, like how are we just upholding this hierarchy that we already have that is incredibly problematic, and saying that the education that people with licenses has is somehow better than people who do not have licenses, which I think is just wrong, and doesn't take into consideration the historical context that psychedelics come from.
I want to just chime in on that and say, yeah, you know, anytime we talk about oppression within a capitalist system, we're talking about a class issue. And so just tapping into what you're saying there, you know, that if the service is expensive, that automatically excludes it's going to be exclusive, excluding more and more queer and trans people, because queer and trans people are experiencing more issues around class and wealth access.
And I think I want to add to that. I think that's why the medical industrial complex could seem like a very far off somewhere thing. But I think in there is also this question about like, how do I actually think that some people deserve things more than others? Like, how have I also internalized that, oh, well, if you could afford it, you should have it. And if you can't, you should probably not do so much, or you should probably go for less. Like, how have I internalized that like if I do enough, if I make enough, then I deserve things that other people who didn't do as much or work as hard as I did don't deserve, right? The medical model isn't a literal physical system. It's a set of ideology that we inherently receive living here. And that when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, because I think there's a way that super bothers me when people are like, yeah, this is horrible. Capitalism's the worst. And then it's like, oh, wait, I deserve this thing because I make more, I worked hard for it, right? And if those two things are happening in the same statement, then there's some friction there that's being ignored about how you would, even though your ideology or theory says I would be totally against people being excluded from psychedelics, look at the ways that you actually think you deserve things because you can afford it or because you have access to it. And it doesn't really come into awareness that it actually isn't something that should have been earned, that it actually was a given that you actually earned, and now you feel you deserve. It happens in very small interactions, and it builds up into our medical industrial complex.
Wow. You all are so much fire. I just, couldn't help but, noting that some of the class and access points that you made could also just as well apply to the adult use model, kind of in addition to, the medical model for psychedelics, which is a whole other can of worms we can maybe unpack. But I'd love to ask you if any of you would be inclined to tell us anything about how you personally embody ethics in your work and in your life.
I can start us off with that. Oh, do you want to go, Emma? No. Okay. I do way more healing work than I want to. Like, I think about this a lot. I just think to myself, and I say this to people when they're like, I want to become a psychedelic therapist, or I want to be a therapist at all. I'm like, do you want to spend your vacation doing more healing work? Do you want to heal every little last thing because you need to, so that you don't take it out on people? Because I think that's, so much of when people are unethical is because of just our own shit. And you get really close up with other people's stuff, and it's very intimate, it's very intense. And I think there's so much about building ourselves as instruments to be able to be in that level of kind of intensity with another person and be that close to them spiritually, psychologically, physically. And so, yeah, God, I just do so much healing work. I mean, really, like, so much. And that's a big part of how I try to maintain myself in terms of being ethical. Yeah, pause there.
Yeah, I think you said, like, how do we embody ethics? And the thing that came up for me is, like, step number one is acknowledging that I have a body. And that just, like, the presence of dissociation and how, like, across the board that is in so many spaces, and our culture, like, teaches us to live outside of our body in so many ways, that to me, that's like gate number one, is just acknowledging you have a body, and also that, like, you have a body in the room with another person's body. And that, like, what is happening in the body and between our bodies is more information than what's coming out of my mouth or what's coming out of your mouth. And that our bodies are communicating with each other in ways that are more complex than we even understand at this point. Like, we don't know so much about what is happening in the relationship between these, like, meat suits we're all walking around in, and so I think just allowing for that and being in the presence of that and allowing the mystery of that in the room with the, like, really intentional awareness of what's actually happening in this thing as I'm relating to somebody, to me is, like, the biggest ethical practice of just being able to say, oh, there's a twinge here. Like, something is happening in my body right now that is giving me some kind of signal that there is something in this space that I need to attend to. And it could be my stuff, it could be your stuff, it could be ancestor stuff, it could be whatever stuff, but there's something here. Because I think that so many ethical violations occur in the space of not acknowledging our own body or what's happening in between our bodies in the room. And so just, like, that's the first step. And I think that in and of itself, for trauma survivors, for practitioners, for those of us that are now doing our lives on computers, that are, like, dissociation is just a common part of our daily life, of that is enough of a practice of just coming over and over again back to the body and letting that be the place that we relate from. Because otherwise we're going to miss all the cues of something is wrong, because our body is so wise at telling us that something's off. And that's both, like, from the practitioner perspective and also from the client perspective, right? When I'm in the client seat, I'm tracking myself, because I'm not going to, if I don't know how my body feels when something's off, I don't have access to my no, which means I don't have access to my yes. Like, we can't have a yes if we don't have a no first. And so really, as a practitioner, encouraging clients to be in their bodies and teaching them skills of how to be in their bodies actually supports the ethical relationship for all sides. And if a practitioner isn't attending to the client's relationship with their body, it's setting up a space for the client to blow past boundaries or to not know when something isn't okay, because the body is always telling us. It's just whether or not we can pay attention to it.
I have I felt like both of y'all are, like, there's a connection between this, what you both said, that feels like it's some, anyways, I'm gonna start speaking. I have always been a really heady person, and so access to body has been much later in time, with hella fucking lot of healing, like, oh my God, something else, right? Like, that feeling very familiar. But that headiness is, like, culturally really expected of us, that we're able to really be these super strategic brains. And I think we can utilize that. I've utilized that to bring me back to my body by constantly seeking to prove myself wrong. Like, really learning things that make my headiness shaky. Like, fuck, I can't rely on this thing. Like, I keep thinking I could rely on my brain fully and my neocortex fully, but I keep learning new things that shake up what I know and shake up what I believe and shake up what I thought was, like, the ultimate truth. And as I keep getting that shakeup, I do learn that I need to learn to trust something else. The more and more I get the shakeup, I'm learning to trust my own body. I'm learning to trust beings and entities I can't see, name, or touch. Being able to trust location, like physicality, like that is more trustworthy more and more, that I allow my neocortex, my brain, to be wrong, to be shown that it doesn't get it. It does not know. And no matter how much I try to strive to know, it'll always fail me. And I have to learn to really lean into that failure, because it reminds me that I need to lean on something else. I need to rely on something else. And so my practice has always been like, I'm a heady person. I'm never going to not be a heady person. But now I have to use that for my benefit. And then I get to use it for my clients' benefits. Because when I'm willing to be wrong, I'm also willing to hear or know that isn't being said. I'm willing to hear what is not being verbalized between us, because I'm so used to seeking where I'm wrong. And sometimes it is irritating when we live in a culture where we really want the authority figure to be the knowing person, the person who knows. It can be really hard for other people. They're like, you're the authority. You're supposed to be the one that knows. In actuality, most of the time I'm like, let's grieve that most of them didn't know and they kept telling you they knew. Now you're a little fucked, right? Like, so let's be honest about that, because I'm not willing to also pretend I know. I don't know. And so therefore, you're going to have to know for us what needs to happen here. And this is why I need to do the support of like, let's fuck your brain up and be like, I don't know anything, so we can rely on the body. So we can rely on anything else. Let's find something else to rely on, because there's good information there that we lose, especially in growing, even psychedelics, where I feel like I'm even hearing the way we talk about prep and integration, like growing to be like this really cognitive thing, like make it make sense, make the experience make sense. And I think even that, the ethics of trying to interpret for someone so they can have something that makes sense and walk away with a little nugget of goodness, like that, there's an ethics to that that's well before any bodily touch has occurred. It's the person who's willing to put mine, as the person in power, I get to put my interpretation on your experience, is for me already a problem. And so my practice continues to be like, oh, I thought that's what I thought was going on, but I could be really wrong. And so I'm gonna have to just wait and figure out what else shows up, because I can't trust or rely on my ability to think things through, although that's been my superpower.
Another thing I'm thinking about in all of this is I love hearing, hearing all of this, and I'm noticing us talking about it, and yeah, the context of being clinicians and whatnot, and healing ourselves. And I think another piece is just being in community and being in a mentor relationship, like being with peers, being mentored. That community accountability, I think, is a lot more realistic than like individual accountability. And we have to work at building conscious community. We have to work at building community that's interested in more intimacy and conflict being a part of intimacy, and interested in being embodied, and, interested in caring and being sort of committed, and not just like what we were talking about with the Florie brought up, the disposability of people. And I think as practitioners, as people, we really need to embed ourselves in very strong community and be creating strong community. And I also think it's a really important thing for us to be, to me, that is a huge part of integration work, is to help people just stop being isolated. And, not everybody's isolated, but even people who have a lot of community can feel really isolated. You can have a lot of people in your life and not really let them in. You can have a lot of people in your life and not really like depend on other people, and depending and dependency. It's like so stigmatized to need and depend in our culture. But it's like the truest form of intimacy to me is like, can I just rely on you and be okay with it? And can you rely on me and be okay with it? So I think this is a really big part of being ethical. Yeah, it makes an environment where you can be more honest about yourself. It also makes an environment where you can be more like getting your needs met in a lot of different ways. And I think one of the things that can sometimes happen in circumstances where people are unethical with their clients is that they're going to their clients for a need. And it's okay for us to have certain needs from the people that we work with. Like, of course, I want to get the need of having meaning in my life. Of course, I want to feel gratified as being like a good clinician, you know. But I think there's such a level of skill to go in at a really nuanced level and be able to sort of assess, like, what else am I asking for from you? And when I start to get into a place where I'm like, maybe going to be unethical, why is that? What is the need here that I need to take somewhere else? I'll pause there. I saw things about how maybe we have to move to Q&A, but yeah.
Yes.
One thing before we jump, Diana, just if I could be quick.
Sure, yeah. We're inviting questions, but please continue on. We haven't yet.
Just like grief. I think that a part of embodying ethics is allowing ourselves to grieve. And that our culture does not do collective grief rituals. We don't grieve. And that it's like the grief of not being perfect, the grief of harm, the grief of all of the systems, the grief of all the trauma of that, like disconnecting from that, dissociating from our grief keeps us out of our body. It keeps us out of relationships. It keeps us out of community. It keeps us in the neocortex. And that, like, just experiencing grief as a part of the human experience, I think, is a practice of being ethical and being accountable. And that without that, we are more likely to transgress because we're not aware of the reality of loss in our life. And and to add the queerness onto it, to me, it's like, I come out every day, you know, and that there's grief in that every single fucking day of not being seen, of having to be something other than normal, of even having to be queer. Why can't I just be Emma? And experiencing that grief for me actually holds me in accountability of being able to stay lined up for myself and for my community and for the clients that I'm serving.
And I just want to pull on that, like that grief also lets us be really clear about what we're missing. When we try to get things from our clients, it's often because there's a grief that we haven't acknowledged about something we didn't get, that we're pretending is not there. And so we're seeking, and it's like quietly like trying to get stuff from people, and it's not happening. But when we do what you're saying, like that grief, then we're like, wow, I really grieve that, like, I could just show up in a place and someone feels the inherent worth in me. I don't need to try to get my client to give it to me, because like I've already really been with, like, okay, I need to find community to do that, because I'm really aware that I need that. There's a longing and there's a grief about how I didn't get that. And I get to go find community that can do that. And I don't need you to do that for me.
Excellent points. Thank you for continuing on that thread. And just want to make sure folks are aware that we are kind of shifting into a Q&A portion here. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Alissa and I will present them to our panelists. And maybe, you know, kind of while we're waiting for folks to come forward, one of the things that a question that came to my mind as you all were speaking, kind of about the intimacy and the importance of relationship, was sort of the contrast between that, you know, kind of unethical practice and the pressure to scale psychedelic work, right? And so I'm just curious, you know, if you have comments, you know, sort of about the contrast there between, you know, small community-based ethics and accountability to the scale.
I think that's a big problem, actually. I mean, the pressure to scale, I think, like, I'm like, what drives that? Money, prestige, impulse, like needs for control. I don't know. You know, I mean, I think it depends on the person, people involved in it, but I just think that communities that are, well, there's a question of how big a community can get and still be accountable, how big can a community get and still be intimate? And I fear what is going to happen in the psychedelic movement, or kind of the medical model, or, I mean, we're going to see a lot more people experience more harm. And I think I also fear that because there's, it takes so much skill to be a healing practitioner. It really does. I mean, I've been practicing for, I think 12 years, and my consultant has been practicing for probably 30. And recently I was coming to her with like a problem, and she said something to me that I say to people when I supervise them. And I supervise people who are like their first year of training, She was like, "Oh yeah, Laura, the thing is, when you get past 20 years, that'll be," and I was like, wow, I'm like a little baby in this, and I've worked really hard and done so much healing work and so many trainings. It's really difficult. And so this idea that people are just kind of like jump on the train with their little 1-year psychedelic training. And I'm not saying that's not bad, but then I want people to be so deeply embedded in community, basically, to hold them. There's so much more level of apprenticeship that's needed to do really, really good work. So much of your own healing work. And I fear that we aren't, I fear that we aren't, as a whole community, just really sitting people down to have that big conversation with them about like, this is a lifetime of work to be good at it. And to, really also, I mean, a huge part I think about becoming a practitioner is also really sitting in, what does it mean to be bad at it? Like, I know that for the first couple of years, I had horrible anxiety when I was starting to work as a therapist, because my God, I was so bad at it. And you have to go through so much being bad at it to get good at it. And it's excruciating to just tolerate the shame. So yeah, I have questions about like becoming a practitioner where you are supporting people to go into really intense psychedelic states. For anybody who does that work, you probably know sometimes people do things in those states that can disturb you. It can be really intense. It's a lot of pressure on the clinician to be able to sit with that and respond in a way that's continually therapeutic. All the stuff that happens outside of the session also requires so much on you. And so I wish so deeply for people to be coming out of these trainings and knowing that it's going to benefit them so much and their work so much, to be very humble and just stay in deep like mentorship, apprenticeship relationships. Which I don't know is possible in this giant scaling model. Back to your question.
Yeah, got it. It's interesting. What came up for me, Dana, when you asked that question was something completely different than I expected, but we'll just go with what's coming in. What came up was like, oh, crisis of belonging. In that, like, what if this impulse around scaling is like the desperate need for community, and this like, I'll try this, and then I'll try this, and then I'll try this, and then I'll try this. And I know, and then we're just getting further and further away from each other, actually, when we get in these models where we need to get bigger and bigger, and that the impulse to get bigger, to expand, is because the connection isn't happening in the small space that you're already at. And I've been involved in enough psychedelic organizations that have that scaling mentality, and then just been like, no, that you feel it inside it. The conversation is, how do we get more people in here, instead of who's actually here and how do I connect with you? And that, like, that just that crisis of like, we don't actually feel like we belong to something. And that I think psychedelics can help us feel a sense of belonging to the earth. They can help us feel a sense of belonging to ourselves, to each other, to community. But that if we're not doing them with this impulse of what's actually here already, then we do start looking outside and trying to get bigger and bigger in a way that actually just seeks to disconnect us even further from each other.
Thanks, y'all. I personally have a vendetta against scale, personally, and it's really because, like, one, it's never literally made sense in my head. Like, it doesn't actually, like, the numbers don't work. Like it actually doesn't work. Like, and as I've already mentioned, I love things that work. And so they don't work, one. Two is that like scaling is actually like a fun story, you know, like when we moved from being nomadic people after the ice age, like, you know, the fucking world thawed out, like wild, right? The world thaws out and people are all of a sudden like able to like stay in one place and make like home of that place, where before that was just not, you couldn't grow things on ice. You couldn't domesticate animals that needed food that you needed to be able to provide at all times. And so growing things was about domesticating your animals, feeding the people who take care of the animals. And then it like was about like, oh, well, we're still targets to people. Our fellow nomadic folks who are still roaming, now we're targets. So let's marry them in and like make them part of our culture now. So they'll protect our stuff with us. And that just kept going and going and going until we had villages, until we had kingdoms, until we had fucking governments. Like scaling is inherently about how do I protect what's mine? How many gatekeepers can I create from something being taken from me? And so scaling to me is just always about like that lack of belonging. I'm saying like, it's about like trying so hard to make something that feels like I have it and it can't be taken from me. And the pressure to scale is always going to be because even the ones of us who are helping the scaling happen, we will never be the benefactors of the scaling. And so like by really being honest about like, oh, the thing I'm trying to protect by creating 1 million doors before you can get to it, do I even get to have that? Do I get that? I don't get that. So I'm not invested in your scales. I can't be, because I'll never benefit from it. And so I think when we think of scaling, when we think of how do we get more people in the door, how do we grow, all the different flowery language we use to make it seem like we're not trying to accumulate people, we need to have that part that's like, that doesn't feel good to me in me, because I think what we're doing is protecting certain protecting things I'll never benefit from. I don't even know what they are. I can't even tell you what they are. I don't know what they are. But whatever they are, I know I'm not getting it, but I'm working really hard to protect it for something or someone else.
Would you say, Florie, that it's like the interest of elites that's being protected?
Absolutely. Always the interest of elites. Always in this here. Yes, always. Yeah. And even in the small farmers who were nomads and became suddenly agriculturists, like everyone wasn't, you know, there were some people who had to make the rules, and the rules were created to protect what they thought was what needed to happen to secure what they thought was important. Mm-hmm. But like, if that stuff is not really important, then maybe they wouldn't work so hard to protect it. And we would stop trying to help them do that. Yeah, but definitely elites. Yeah, thanks. That's so.
Well, it doesn't appear that we have any questions in the chat.
Oh, wait, I actually think there is a question in the chat that I kind of want to answer.
Oh, okay. I can't see it for some reason.
Yeah, well, it says, how are you all so good? You are so cool.
Oh, yes.
And I actually, when I read that, I was like, I do want to answer this question, if that's okay. And it's not that I want to say how I got to be so cool, but it is because, you know, I get asked a lot from people who have who are not yet practitioners. They'll be like, you're so cool, everything you're doing, how do I become like you? And it's so I've sat and thought a lot about this, because there's sort of this like, how do I, like, what path should I get on? And I want to like highlight that I do think a lot of the thinking, and I don't know if this is true for you and Florie and Emma, a lot of the thinking that I bring into the psychedelic space is from doing activism. It's from being a queer person. It's from going out and partying and like dancing and realizing I have a body that way, and like really living life. And it's something I talk a lot about is it's also from play. Like people are like, what did you do? I'm going to go to this college and this, you know, and I'm just like, I went to a terrible college. I grew up in poverty. Like I went to a state school where they paid me to go there. I went to the only place I could afford. You know, the people are like, when did you do? I'm like, I spent most of my 20s as a punk listening to really bad music and, you know, like that I still love and listen to. And I want to like just kind of highlight that because I think, yeah, just so much. So another like piece of just like being queer and being in any kind of sort of like professionalized space is like just remaining true to play, pleasure, sensuality, excitement, aliveness, and all of that fuels into being a strong clinician. And being able to, you know, a lot about being queer in this society is being willing to say, I'm gonna fucking do this, even though a lot of people are telling me I shouldn't. And I think that in the context of like becoming an ethical practitioner, you know, getting enough training, really doing your own healing work, there's so much also about just like exploring who you are, being in your community, showing up, and just really living your life. So that's how I got that cool. And I think it's an important part of being a clinician.
I did not think we were going to actually answer this, but now that you said that, thank you for the question, Angela. People have asked too, like, how do you do? And I'm just like, honestly, I just stay so heartbroken all the time. It's like the opposite of what you just said, but the heartbrokenness does allow me to dance and do all the good stuff and the fun stuff. But like, I just stay heartbroken. Like, I don't let myself heal from heartbreak because there's just too many new things to be heartbroken about. And it helps me try to, like, the neocortical me wants to be like, I gotta figure this out then. Because I can't stay hard. Like, what do I have to do? What needs to happen? What needs to occur? Because I can't stay like this, even though I know I will. Like, it's just a fruitless, like, endeavor. But I'm, like you said, I'm just gonna keep doing it, even though, like, why? And I think part of that is the heartbrokenness of like, I'm gonna keep getting my heart broken, and I'm willing to do that. And I'm willing to have joy, and I'm willing to have fun. I'm willing to be in community, and I'm willing to have others help me hold heartbreak. I'm willing to figure out what is it like to be really in others' heartbreak. Like all of that, I'm not hiding from it. I'm not trying to move away from it. And so then there's a part of me that now has to be really thoughtful about, then what do I do? If things are gonna keep breaking my heart, I need to do something, because life is not worth living when I'm heartbroken 24/7. And I need to figure something out. And that is the driver for me to like keep figuring and reading and doing and finding and talking. And it's just nonstop, never ends. I'm exhausted. But yeah.
I love that, Florie, and I could fucking talk for a whole another hour about what it means to be heartbroken and stay like, because I'm so with you, but I'll stop because I know we got to stop soon. So Emma.
I just need a breath before I respond. Yeah, the heartbroken piece really, that feels really true for me. I mean, my answer was going to be, I'm just grieving all the time and feeling joy all the time. And that, like, I actually remember the moment where I realized that the more heartbreak I feel was the more love that I felt, like that how correlated, that those were just, for me at least, exactly correlated in my life and in my body. So like ditto to everything the two of you said. And I think the only thing that I have to add is that I guess there's two things. One is to just like let myself fuck up over and over and over again, and to like be in that process, and to kind of what I said earlier of like, I don't think we ever arrive anywhere. Like I don't expect to be done with anything in my life. And actually like letting go of that over and over and over again, because some part of me very much wants to like fix the thing and be like, we did it and it's done. I don't have to fuck with that anymore, you know? But like, it's constantly coming back, whether it's my trauma or the system or relationships or whatever else. Like we're on this spiral together, and I don't think we're going to get to the top. And so just allowing that process and knowing that we're going to mess up and that there's so much that we don't know, and actually like having my seat there in the mystery and in the things are going to be hard, and I'm going to mess things up and you're going to mess things up, and we're going to grieve and love and play and try to do all of the things that, for me at least, like that allows the work to move through, of that places where I have in my career, in my personal life, in any of it, like the stagnancy comes up when I think I'm done with something. and that is never actually the case, and that something needs to shift, and that it requires the breaking open over and over and over again in order to allow the movement and the flow to come through. And that's, for me at least, like, that's where the magic comes from, is from keeping my feet rooted there.
Well, we did have one question pop up in the chat, but I really kind of want to end here, just acknowledge that question, and perhaps, I don't know if following up with you all afterwards is possible, but that's just a really powerful ending. And I'm really just in awe of all of you, and thank you so much for this conversation and your perspectives, and speaking to the hard truths and the conflict and the grief and the heartbreak and the joy and the play. So yeah, I think that feels like a good place to end. Thank you all so much for being here and for this rich conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Such an honor. Laura,
Thank you, everyone.
and Alissa, you're amazing.